Life is full of surprises, but sometimes we have to look closer to see that it's also a series of patterns. Even if you're the spontaneous kind, you still follow certain patterns. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there is freedom in following patterns or routine, whatever you want to call it. But it's important to spot them so we can decide whether we want to keep living in that same structure. And in photography, it's important to spot them since patterns are a powerful tool of composition that can turn a simple image into a captivating story. So what is pattern? Today, we're taking a closer look at pattern and also repetition, because they are very closely related, but they are not the same thing. What's the difference? Repetition is the recurrence of the same or similar elements in an image, and pattern is a deliberate use of repetition to create a structured visual effect. So pattern is created by the use of repetition. It's a more structured arrangement of repeated elements. For example, this is repetition. There is no sense of predictable order, but as you can see, there is a recurring theme in the scene, such as this group of people wearing white shoes and black pants, and then we also have these shadows from a fence which create repeated lines here in the ground. This is a pattern. It's a more thoughtful approach towards a repeated element, which in this case are bicycles. With the use of this pattern, I'm creating a sense of rhythm, depth, and movement, drawing us deeper into the image thanks to the arrangement of these bikes, which introduce different layers and also forming leading lines. One more example. I would call this simply repetition. There's a predictable order, but in my opinion it doesn't quite fit into the pattern world, because I'm not using these repeated elements with a very clear intention to create a specific structure or visual effect. However, this is a pattern. There is much more intention or more thought in the arrangement of these two buildings to create the final image. By the way, this is not a video about what is repetition and what is pattern. I simply want to state that they are not the same thing, although sometimes the line between them can be very thin. These are the same bicycles from the previous image. I took this shot a few moments before, and honestly, I wouldn't even know where to put this. The image in the left is not as intentional as the one in the right in the use of repetition, and some might call it a pattern, others just repetition. But what do you think? The good thing is, it doesn't really matter. It's not about categorizing, but it's good to understand how these work and the difference between them. So to summarize, repetition, the recurrence of same or similar elements within a composition, and pattern, a structured arrangement of repeated elements to create a visual effect. And now that we have that out of the way, let's move on. What's the importance of both repetition and pattern? They're important because our eyes are drawn to repeated elements, and this makes the image much more engaging and keeps the viewer's attention longer, which is obviously what we want, and it does so for several reasons. They emphasize a theme or a message. For example, these lamps in the spectacular Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, a magical market that feels like a maze, so it's a wonderful place to get lost, and a little claustrophobic sometimes, but it's definitely worth a visit. They create order and structure to the composition, and this is especially true for patterns. For example, this image I took in Nazaré, Portugal, or this image of the iconic Edificio España in Madrid's Plaza de España. Even though we are creating order and structure, patterns can also be irregular, so not every element has to be identical. And this opens the door to more abstract interpretations, like this image of a window. Nothing here is the same, but I consider this a pattern. Different, but it's still a pattern. They create movement. They guide our eyes smoothly from one element to the next, like in this example of all these people laying in the beach. I wish I was there right now, honestly. But aren't you curious to see what everyone is doing? Maybe it's just me, but I'm a little bit nosy. Another example are these architecture elements from a building that resemble the waves of the ocean. There's a lot of movement in this image. Pattern can also act as a tool to direct our eyes towards a specific subject. Notice how the pattern in the scene guides our eyes towards our subject. The layers formed by these columns add depth and direction, while the fence doors served as leading lines. In a similar way, this pattern of lines guides us towards this woman who has just left the office, now free to enjoy the rest of her evening with some friends over a delightful bottle of red wine. In this image, there are several elements of composition: pattern, leading lines, and also contrast. The woman's dark outfit stands out against the lighter background. By now, I hope you're starting to see that images can have multiple elements of composition, and this image is a good example to lead us to our next point: breaking the pattern. Patterns can be quite predictable and even boring, and that's not what we want, but that's an easy fix. Let's break the pattern. When we use patterns, our aim is to create order and structure, but we can disrupt that structure introducing an unexpected element. Our eyes are drawn directly to that point of disruption. It adds a sense of surprise, like taking a kid to a pizza place and ordering a salad, a bottle of water, and some grapes for dessert. We are creating an expectation and breaking it. This can make the viewer ask questions about why the pattern was broken. So by breaking the pattern, we introduce conflict. We strengthen the narrative of the image, and everything becomes much more interesting. By using pattern, we can also create a narrative such in this image, and help the viewers understand a little bit more of what's going on, providing context and clues about where this man is and what he's doing. I mean, he could be buying shoes, but that would be a surprise. But yeah, let's move on. Patterns, much like other elements of composition, can be found everywhere. From man-made objects and structures, which are generally more regular and more precise, to patterns in nature, which are often more irregular and complex. But when they do appear, they can be quite special and surprising. Before we part ways and you go on to do whatever it is you have to do, one last tip. All the photos you've seen today were taken with focal lengths ranging from 50 to 135 millimeters. Longer focal lengths are excellent for patterns because they compress the space, bringing elements closer together. And it's also easier to frame cleanly because we have a narrower field of view. So it makes it easier to focus on specific details. We can certainly capture patterns with wider focal lengths, but it can be more challenging. So with that last piece of information, it's time to end this. I hope you've enjoyed this little episode. And now it's your turn to get lost in patterns. See you next time.